Welcome to War Bios, the podcast where we delve into the intricacies of history's most pivotal conflicts. I'm your host, General Biography, and today we're going to explore one of the most iconic battles in American history, the Battle of Bunker Hill. This legendary clash took place on June 17, 1775, during the Siege of Boston, and it would prove to be a crucial turning point in the American Revolution. To understand the significance of the Battle of Bunker Hill, we must first examine the complex web of events that led to this pivotal moment. The American Revolution was not just a simple struggle for independence. It was a complex and multifaceted conflict that involved politics, economics, and ideology. The British government had imposed a series of taxes on the colonies, including the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts, which had sparked widespread resentment and resistance among the colonists. One of the key events that contributed to the growing tensions between the British and the colonists was the Boston Massacre, which took place on March 5, 1770. On that fateful evening, a group of British soldiers fired into a crowd of protesters, killing 5 colonists and wounding several others. The incident was widely publicized, and it helped to galvanize public opinion against the British. In the months leading up to the Battle of Bunker Hill, the colonial militia had been engaged in a series of skirmishes with British forces. On April 19, 1775, the first shots of the American Revolution were fired at Lexington and Concord, where a group of militiamen clashed with British soldiers. The colonists emerged victorious, and the British were forced to retreat back to Boston. As the summer of 1775 approached, the colonial militia, now known as the Continental Army, began to lay siege to Boston. The city was heavily fortified, with British troops occupying key positions on Breed's Hill, Bunker Hill, and other strategic locations. The colonists, led by General William Prescott, decided to launch a bold attack on the British positions, hoping to drive them out of the city. The decision to fortify Breed's Hill, which would eventually become the site of the Battle of Bunker Hill, was not taken lightly. The American commanders, including General Prescott and Colonel Richard Gridley, were confident in their ability to hold the high ground and inflict significant casualties on the British Army. They spent several days constructing earthen redoubts and fortifications, preparing for the inevitable British response. As we explore the historical context of the Battle of Bunker Hill, it's essential to understand the complex relationships between the key figures involved. General William Howe, who would lead the British forces during the battle, was a seasoned military commander with extensive experience in combat. He was determined to crush the rebellion and maintain control over Boston. On the other hand, General William Prescott, who led the colonial militia during the battle, was a charismatic leader with a deep understanding of the terrain and the tactics of his enemy. He was confident in his ability to hold the high ground and inflict significant casualties on the British Army. As we've set the stage for the Battle of Bunker Hill, it's clear that this pivotal moment in American history was the result of a complex interplay of politics, ideology, and military strategy. The battle would be fought on multiple fronts, with both sides suffering heavy losses. But in the end, it would be the bravery and sacrifice of the colonial militia that would shape the course of American history. The fate of Boston, and indeed the future of the American Revolution, hung in the balance, as the two armies clashed in a maelstrom of cannon fire, musketry, and bloodshed. On June 16, 1775, a group of colonial militiamen, led by General William Prescott, Colonel Richard Gridley, and Colonel Robert Gardner, began constructing earthen redoubts and fortifications on Breed's Hill, which overlooked Boston Harbor. The British Army, under the command of General William Howe and General Henry Clinton, had been occupying key positions in Boston, but they were unaware of the colonial militia's plan to fortify Breed's Hill. As the night wore on, the colonists worked tirelessly to complete their defenses, constructing a large redoubt and several smaller earthworks. Meanwhile, British sentries spotted the activity on Breed's Hill and alerted their commanders. General Howe and General Clinton quickly realized the strategic importance of the hill and decided to launch a counterattack to drive the colonists out. The British forces assembled on the beach near Boston with over 2,000 troops, including grenadiers, light infantry, and marines. They were supported by naval gunfire from British warships in the harbor. The colonial militia, numbering around 1,500 men, was largely composed of inexperienced soldiers, but they were determined to hold their ground. As the British troops approached Breed's Hill, they were met with a hail of cannon fire and musketry from the colonial lines. The British artillery responded with a barrage of their own, pounding the colonial positions with cannonballs and grapeshot. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the colonists held firm, inflicting heavy casualties on the British troops. The British launched 2 frontal assaults on the colonial redoubt, but both were repelled with heavy losses. The colonists' defenses were well constructed, and their artillery was effectively positioned to rake the British lines. However, as the battle raged on, the colonists began to run low on ammunition and supplies. It was during this critical moment that General Prescott uttered his famous words, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." This tactical decision allowed the colonists to conserve their ammunition and wait for the British troops to come within close range. When the British launched their third assault, the colonists unleashed a devastating volley of musketry, cutting down hundreds of British soldiers. Despite their bravery, the colonists were ultimately forced to retreat from Breed's Hill due to lack of ammunition and reinforcements. The British Army had suffered over 1,000 casualties, including many high-ranking officers, while the colonists lost around 400 men. Although the British technically won the battle, they had suffered a strategic defeat, as the heavy losses they incurred made it difficult for them to continue their occupation of Boston. The Battle of Bunker Hill was a pivotal moment in American history, marking a turning point in the siege of Boston and setting the stage for the eventual withdrawal of British forces from the city. The bravery and sacrifice of the colonial militia had proven that they could stand toe-to-toe with the British Army, and their tactical innovations would influence military strategy for centuries to come. In the months following the battle, the British Army, under the command of General William Howe and General Henry Clinton, struggled to recover from the heavy losses they had incurred. The Army's morale was low, and many officers were critical of the decision to launch a series of frontal assaults against the colonial militia's well-entrenched positions. Meanwhile, the Continental Congress, which had been meeting in Philadelphia since May 1775, took advantage of the British Army's weakness to launch a series of strategic initiatives. In June 1775, the Congress established the Continental Army, with George Washington as its commander-in-chief. The new army was tasked with coordinating the efforts of the various colonial militias and defending American territory against British attacks. As the summer of 1775 wore on, the siege of Boston continued, with the British Army trapped in the city and the colonial militia surrounding them. In July 1775, the Continental Congress issued a declaration known as the Olive Branch Petition, which called for reconciliation with Great Britain and an end to hostilities. However, the petition was rejected by King George III, who saw it as a sign of weakness. In response to the king's rejection, the Continental Congress began to take more drastic measures. In August 1775, they launched a campaign to capture British-held forts in the north, including Fort Ticonderoga and Fort St. John's. The campaign was successful, and the colonists were able to gain control of these strategic locations. As the fall of 1775 approached, the British Army's position in Boston became increasingly untenable. In October 1775, General Washington launched a series of attacks against British positions, including a successful assault on British-held Charlestown. The British responded with a series of bombing raids against colonial positions, but they were ultimately unable to break the siege. In March 1776, the British Army finally evacuated Boston, leaving behind many of their heavy guns and supplies. The city was occupied by the Continental Army, and the siege of Boston came to an end. The Battle of Bunker Hill had been a decisive moment in the siege, as it had shown that the colonial militia could stand toe-to-toe with the British Army and inflict significant casualties. The aftermath of the battle also saw significant changes in the leadership of the Continental Army. In July 1775, George Washington was appointed commander-in-chief, and he began to reorganize the army along more formal lines. The army's logistics and supply systems were improved, and new units, such as the Continental Artillery, were established. As we look back on the Battle of Bunker Hill, it is clear that it was a turning point in American history. The bravery and sacrifice of the colonial militia had proven that they could stand up to the British Army, and their tactical innovations would influence military strategy for centuries to come. the battle also marked the beginning of a long and bloody conflict, as the American Revolution would go on to last for several more years. In the words of General Washington, "The liberties of our country, the freedom of our civil constitution, are worth defending at all hazards, and it is our duty to defend them against all attacks." The Battle of Bunker Hill was a testament to this resolve, as American patriots fought bravely for their rights and freedoms. The legacy of the Battle of Bunker Hill can still be seen today in the many monuments and memorials that commemorate the battle. The Bunker Hill Monument, which stands tall in Boston's Charlestown neighborhood, is a testament to the bravery and sacrifice of the colonial militia. As we look out upon this monument, we are reminded of the enduring spirit of American patriotism and the ongoing struggle for freedom and democracy. That's all for today's War Bios. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, I'm General Biography reminding you to keep marching toward victory.